morning, everyone, and welcome to the Wellbeing Festival on day 3. Day 3 already been full of exciting sessions, and hopefully everyone is looking forward to today's session as well. So let's get on with what we're getting on with. So today we're going to look at why teams matter and what makes a healthy team. Excellent topic. Really looking forward to this, bearing in mind the conversations that we have as part of L&D as well. Myself, I'll be facilitating the start and the end of the session, and my colleague will be in the background being like busy, monitoring things like chat boxes and making sure that everyone is sort of safe and needs any support there. Please note the session is recorded, so we can share it later on with colleagues who can't make today, but you can also use the chat box today to ask questions, to share emojis, to put reactions to what our presenters are saying, or anything that you want to. Please use that and engage and participate as we go through. You can also, at the end, when questions are being asked for, please use the raise hand function as well, because you can be invited to come on. You are more than welcome to leave your cameras on throughout this session, because it's always good to see people's faces, but please just keep your mics on mute unless we're inviting people in to have a conversation if it's required. Also, transcript is available. If you click on your 3 dots and go down, you can put the transcript on, which means you can read what is being said as well. It gives me great pleasure to hand over the session to Paul and Arabella, who I'm sure will do a better introduction of themselves and what they're about to do than I ever could. But enjoy the session and many thanks. Stop sharing, David. I've got the wrong screen. Oh my goodness, I told you what could go wrong. Paul and Arabella, over to you.
Okay, should we share, or maybe if we say hi first. So good morning, everybody, and thanks very much for having us at the Wellbeing Festival. So if we just introduce ourselves, my name's Paul Flecknoe. For anybody that doesn't know me, I'm a psychologist by background. I'm head of psychology and psychological therapies at NHFT. And Arabella.
Morning, everybody. I'm Arabella Kurtz, clinical psychologist and lead for Stronger Together, the not so new, we're a year old now, system-wide staff health and wellbeing service. Very happy to be here today and talk about such an interesting topic.
Thanks, Arabella. So I'll just share my screen and hopefully that is coming through okay. So we're going to talk a bit about why teams matter, what makes a healthy team. And so we wanted to start off with in a way, by asking you. So if you think about the best team you've ever worked in, and then we're going to ask you 2 questions using the magic of Slido, and then you'll be able to see responses as people make them. So the first question is, how did it feel to work in this team? And you can answer this by going to the Slido website at the address and putting in the code, or for people familiar with QR codes, you can use your phone's camera. And I think Dawn will also put in the chat sort of instructions for using Slido for anybody who's not kind of familiar with it. So this first one's going to come through as a word cloud. So as people type different words, and this is probably good to do as one word if you can, which people seem to be doing, then the words that are typed more often will be bigger. So I'll just give you a few minutes for that. Great. So a few people still typing, but you can see some really clear kind of themes. So words like trusted, valued, supported, happy, safe are the most.
These are emotional words, aren't they, Paul?
Yeah. And then there's lots of other, I suppose in a way, you might say related words around the side of that. Yeah. Okay, I think one person's still typing, but I think that gives hopefully everybody a bit of a sense of how it felt.
Mm.
Okay, so on to the next question. What made the difference? So that's how you felt. Why was it a good team to work in? Why, or how was it, if you were trying to explain it to someone, why was that a good team to work in? And this time it won't be a word cloud, it'll just be, you will see people's responses as they type them. So I think it will kind of scroll down, but you'll get a sort of flavour of it from people.
It's interesting to see leadership coming through straight away, isn't it, Paul?
Yeah, leadership, respect, kind.
Cohesion, everyone had a part.
Everyone had a voice, shared objectives, good communication, kindness, help each other out, clear goals.
We've also got things coming into the chat box as well, guys, like things like respected, supported by manager. I'll let you know if there's any more coming through.
Yeah, worked as a team. Felt safe. Respected opinions. Great. Few people still typing, so I'll just give it a couple more minutes. Yeah.
It's so good to get people just connecting to the topic through their experiences rather than thinking about it in the abstract, because it affects us so much personally.
And I think what I'd say is, as we sort of go through these slides and have some time at the end for discussion, sort of bear what you've written and what other people have written in mind, sort of through the lens of these kind of statements, really, because it's really interesting to see these, and we'll try and sort of thread some of what we're going to talk about in with some of what people have written here. So it looks like most people have had a chance to contribute to that. So that's really interesting. Thanks for doing that. So
could be honest was there, Paul, linking with safety.
Okay, thank you, Arabella. Great. So we just want to start off with a little bit with so sometimes we're asked to work with teams, and one of the first questions quite often is who is in the team, and more often than perhaps you might think, that in itself then generates a bit of a conversation about who is in the team and what is the team. So we thought we'd start off a little bit looking at that. So there are, of course, lots of different definitions, but I think this distinction, and this is, I think, from Michael West, who writes a lot about teams, about a work group and a team. So a work group, and the key difference really is how much interdependence there is. So a work group might not be that interdependent. They might not need each other that much. They might be more based on a hierarchy or an organizational sort of system, and they might meet not that often. They might not actually have that much contact, but they might meet periodically to sort of hear and share information. And you can probably think of examples of that. I can certainly think of examples of that in our trust, and I'm sure those of you from other organizations can probably think of examples from yours. A team, by contrast to that, I think if you're trying to summarize it, they need each other. So they plan work, they solve problems, they make decisions, and they're having to communicate and use each other's skills and bring in each other's resources frequently. They need each other to get the work done. But it's helpful in thinking about teams always to ask that initial question, is everyone clear who we mean and who's in the team? And we thought we'd just say very briefly, why do teams matter? What in a way, I suppose, why have teams in the first place? And if you kind of look at some of the history around employment, in some ways, roles that are very, if you like, simple, and you may be doing just one quite practical or mechanical task, you might not need a team because one person could become really, really brilliant at doing that one thing. In a way, you don't need a team to solve that kind of problem. But most of us now work in roles and in situations that have these elements of what some people are now sort of referring to as VUCA. And VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And most healthcare situations have elements of those most of the time. And the key issue with these sort of complex and rapidly changing situations is that no one person, no matter how clever, well-trained, intelligent, thoughtful, reflective, super duper they might be, no one has the answer on their own. And the people that write about this call, the sort of jargon for this is sort of situational humility. So in other words, if somebody's saying, well, I know I have all the answers to this, it's highly unlikely to be right. And so because of that, you need a wide range of ideas and contributions. You need a wide range of skills, of perspectives, of sort of different types of knowledge. And so I suppose in a way, the idea of this whole slide is that to solve complicated and complex problems, you need a team because you need the perspectives and the sort of expertise of more than one person, put really simply. And then a real work team, so building back on this idea of what is a team, or what is, if you like, what Michael West calls a real work team. So a group of people with a shared task. So quite a lot of you in that initial Slido were saying we had a clear goal, we knew what we were there to do, we had a sense of purpose. And so that's a really sort of important element. We talked a bit about a clear, sort of defined and stable membership. There is a literature and some things about a workable size. And this is a complicated one because nobody has completely defined what they mean by a workable size. If you ask a lot of people, they will say ideally it's about 8 to 10. But a lot of us work in teams quite a bit bigger than that. And so if you are leading or in a much, much bigger team, there's then sometimes a question about if it is a big team, how do you deal with that? And are the ways of thinking about how you kind of make the team workable. So for example, the idea of huddles, I think is one way of starting to try and deal with that. So you're not trying to, for example, have meetings of 50 people or engage 50 people at once around all kinds of decisions. And unpacking a sort of overall sense of purpose. So the team knows who they are, like who's in it, and in a way knows each other in terms of roles. They know what the task is, so they know what they're there to do, and this sense of needing each other. So to get this complicated job done, we actually need each other to be able to do it. And I think quite some people in this Slido were saying things like we'd help each other out, we'd sort of work together on the problems or on the objectives we had. And then the other thing Michael West will talk about is there's regular opportunities to review and reflect on the task and the purpose. And one of the things I will always ask if somebody says, have you got any ideas, this team seems to be struggling, or we're trying to think about how to help this team, would be to ask them when did they last have an away day or some other opportunity to undertake that sort of review and reflection. And some teams will say, well, 5 years ago, or we don't do that. So I always think that's an interesting question to ask in terms of opportunities to do that. And away days aren't the only way to do it, but are there those opportunities? So I'm going to hand over to Arabella, and she's going to talk a bit more about the emotional life of teams, and then it will come back to me, and I'll talk a bit more about what makes the difference between a team that's maybe working or is feeling more healthy to work in and one that's perhaps not.
Thanks, Paul. Can we have the slides? At the moment, I can't see the slides large on the screen. They're just on the side. Is there something we can do about that?
So I can't change that, I don't think.
Okay. All right.
I don't know.
Can people see the slide, Emotional Life of Teams? Just give me an indication.
Yep, we can see the slides okay.
Okay, good. All right.
Arabella, if you try clicking on the slide, see if that moves it to the centre for you.
That's what's happened. So hopefully other people will do that if they experience the same thing as me. So we need to go back one, Paul.
Got it.
Okay. So I suppose just before I start talking about the emotional life of teams, it's worth just sharing my experience over the last year working as part of our community. When the staff health and wellbeing hubs were set up, they were set up very much with an idea that they were going to offer support to individuals. And a common experience across the UK amongst the hubs were that teams have come forward for help. And I think it's very important to sort of share this as an experience. And so we've learned a lot in the last year or so about the immense difference it makes working in a team to our working lives. That it can make the difference between a working life being experienced in a very positive way and be so negative sometimes that it leads staff to go off sick or to consider leaving the job. And time and again, staff have said to me in the last year that they've faced immense challenges at work, overwhelming workloads, and sometimes immense complexity and hardship in their work. But if they've been part of a team in which they feel supported, as if they feel that the whole is more than the sum of the parts, and they can overcome challenges together, it makes it all worth it. Not always, but a lot of the time. And we've also heard sometimes about staff for whom the work task may not be that challenging or complicated on the face of it, but where there's isolation in the team, people just don't feel connected, or where there's a lot of interpersonal tension, staff really suffer. The level of distress can't be overstated, really. Next slide, please, Paul. I wanted to sort of connect with the character of teams a little bit and talk to you about the fact that, as I see it, teams have character, personality, history, just in the same way as individuals. And I think it can be very helpful to think about your team and think about how you describe it in these terms. So a team has a character or personality, and I think of that as being the result of both nature and nurture, just like it is for us as individuals. So what that means is the team's character is partly the result of the sort of elements of the team, fixed elements that can't necessarily be changed, you know, the particular individuals that come together, and some of the kind of infrastructure around them, you know, the building, the resources they might have available. Some of these things are kind of fixed elements. But there's also the nurture element, which is very much to do with the environment of the team and how it impacts on them. Both are important parts. A team has a history, a set of shared experiences which have an impact on the team and which contribute to a team's story. And I think it's very often interesting to ask about a team's story. How did this team come together? What were its origins? What have been some of its key experiences? Because often this team narrative can very much affect how the team is in the present and how it faces its future. A team has a context, just like we do as individuals. So a current situation and challenges which a team faces. And the last thing I wanted to talk about, these two issues, depth and complexity, strengths and weaknesses. I think it's really important when you're working with teams to see them as complex things, not easy to understand, and not to oversimplify the character of a team and be too quick to label or describe a team in a particular way. So I think that sometimes teams have quite a kind of rich combination of strengths and weaknesses. A team can be really good at certain things, have impressive resources in particular areas, but also be struggling in others. And I think giving a bit of time to thinking about a team's depth, complexity, strengths and weaknesses is really worthwhile. So just to finish on that, I think just like with individuals, we can label them, and maybe particularly do that from the outside of a team. When we're thinking about another team and describing them, it's easy to label, and we should be very careful about doing that. Next slide, Paul. So what I've tried to do in sort of opening up the emotional life of teams and sharing some thinking with you all is think about 3 issues or aspects that will affect any team working in health and social care, in my experience. These are like sort of challenges that face all teams, and which I think all teams have to find ways of approaching in different ways. And I thought it would be useful to share these ideas with you and for you to maybe have a think about your team and how it manages these particular issues. So the first thing is, all teams have an approach to leadership and followership. Now, sometimes this is just seen as something that's the responsibility of the leader. What kind of leader does this team have? How do they lead? And that's that. But I think it's really a team issue, how leadership and followership are thought about within the team. Who takes responsibility for what? Whether leadership is shared to an extent, or whether it is seen just as the responsibility for a leader. How members of the team respond to the team leader. I'm going to stop in a minute, Dawn, at the end of this, because I can see people are saying things in the chat and I want to respond. Anyway, I wanted to think with you about different teams and the variety of ways that they approach leadership and followership. I guess in healthcare and social care, generally speaking, an ideal is a combination of clear, strong leadership with a good level of participation from others. So you have clarity of leadership and responsibility, but you also have everybody working to their capacity, to their potential, rather than a rigid hierarchy and a separation between leaders and others. Problems in this respect include an over-reliance on a leader, or if you like, a too strong leader, with others disempowered and maybe relatively passive. And then sometimes you could have a problem of a lack of leadership. So this gives you a little bit of an idea, I guess, of the way in which different teams all have to address this and the problems and the positives. Dawn, is there anything in terms of the chat for me to think about at that point?
Yes, absolutely. So we've got a few bits in the chat box already. So firstly, people saying that they agree with your comment, can't imagine coming to work and not having fun at some point. It's a morale booster. Somebody that's been on both sides of the fence, so working with a fab team who helped and supported each other, but also been in a team with a lot of silo working and almost no support. We've got a comment saying, good to hear staff are asking for help. Asking for help doesn't mean we're not coping. We're all human. It's tough times and challenging. So a problem shared is a problem halved. And we have got a question as well. So the question is, who supports and cares for the carers, i.e. the managers who feel lonely or isolated, picking everyone else up and dealing with home, work, health and social? And how would you encourage the manager or supervisor to reach out without it being a worry or concern that they're not doing their job? If you want me to repeat any of that, please let me know.
Well, there's an awful lot there, but I mean, 2 things I'm going to pick up on just because they strike me as important in this area. The first thing is, I think, I mean, it is just a personal view as well as a professional one, but I think reaching out and asking for support is a sign of strength. And that's why I'm in the job I'm in. And I think possibly particularly with teams, you know, being able to reflect as a team, being able to think about what you might be finding difficult as a team. I think Paul's touched on that. Michael West talks about it as team reflexivity. And I think teams that do that are stronger teams. And the other thing I would say is a lot of leaders have sought support from Stronger Together in the last year and a half. We do think that it's very important that the service we offer is confidential and safe, because leaders need to be able to do that in a safe, private, separate way, as well as possibly do a bit more of it with their teams and together. I'll move on at this point. The second issue that we think all teams face, and is very, very important that it's acknowledged, is the issue of difference and diversity within the team. So a team is made up of individuals, and Paul talked about the value of a team as being to do with this, the fact that people have different talents, different abilities, and you bring them together and you have more than the sum of your parts. That's how a team works. So it's a problem if a team can't embrace that, and that everybody has to be the same, think the same, do the same. Then you've got a team that isn't working creatively and isn't working to its full potential. And I think, so all teams have to have an approach, if you like, to this whole issue of difference. At the same time, you also need a team to cohere, to pull together, to sometimes operate with a common task and a common mind. So you've got kind of sameness, if you like, and agreement at one end. And then at the other, you've got a celebration of difference and diversity. And it must, for all teams, be about getting a good enough balance, something that feels like it's, you know, neither at one end of the scale or the other, but is working for that team, so that you can pull together and have common projects and activities, but also draw on the different individuals in the team. Now, this is something that I think we shouldn't be naive. It's a challenge for any team. It's not something that's easy to do, but it's something that as teams we should be talking about, thinking about our approach to it, and that leaders should be encouraging. I think some of the problems that we see that cause real distress and difficulty are in this area. And just to give you a couple of examples, sometimes you have a team that can't talk about difference within the team, can't really recognize that individuals will have very different perspectives, and that's okay. And then you can get an externalization of the problem. So a way in which the problems in life, the difficulties, the disagreements are always out there in another team, another service, another organization. And that's not at all helpful in terms of the work we do between teams and as larger organizations. So that's one problem that you see. And the other, which is, you know, real problem in health and social care at the moment, we know this from the staff survey, it's bullying and discrimination and scapegoating that can go on in teams and services. So that's when a particular individual or group of individuals ends up being the sort of problem carrier for the team. So all difference, all problems are sort of, if you like, seen as being to do with this particular individual or group of individuals, rather than disagreement and difference being something that can be shared in a team, you know, thought about, that people will sort of, depending on the situation and the issue, vary in their responses. So I think this is a second very, very, very important aspect to think about. Somebody just put, being ignored is a very important, very distressing experience and can be just as bad as being bullied or discriminated against. And I think that's absolutely right. That sort of isolation within a team setting. And lastly, and I do think this chimes with many of the comments, because many of you have talked about support in a team as such a key issue. and the solidarity and connection we get from our colleagues. And I think the pandemic has brought home to us the importance of connection in our working lives. This last issue I want to think about is the way in which the team approaches care of its members. Now, all teams will have an approach to this. And even if it's not something that's talked about, or even if you're in a team in which the need for care is dismissed, you know, this isn't a team that needs anything. We're all just focused on the task and hardworking, and that's that. That's still an approach to care, and maybe one that doesn't give enough acknowledgement and time to it. Now, in this area, you can have at two ends of the spectrum, what I've called a kind of tough team, or a team that doesn't really need anything, which of course is not realistic. It's not true. And is, if you like, exclusively focused on the task out there. That's a problem in one sense. At the other end of a spectrum, you can have a team that's overly focused on looking after its members, and where somehow the sense of the job and the task gets lost. And that's the other end of the spectrum. And again, you know, it's very, very much about finding a middle way, or a way for the team that works, where there's enough of a focus on both the task and the work that needs to be done, but there isn't a denial of the need to look after members. So there we go, Paul. That's a whistle-stop tour through some pretty big team themes.
Great, thank you. Shall we just check in for questions? I've seen one come in about inter-team conflict. So any ideas, solutions? This is something we in L&D often get asked for support with. It's often very emotional. Often the manager supervisor does not feel supported by their own manager. Any thoughts? So I thought maybe, did you want to say anything about that now, or should we hold that?
Well, I suppose I would want to reiterate that the support for managers is very important. And also, I think the way an organisation fosters connection between managers rather than isolation and competition. Because when you talk about inter-team conflict, I think that's much more likely to happen, wouldn't you think, Paul? If managers are feeling that they're having to protect their own patch very fiercely, rather than being given opportunities to collaborate, work together, build towards common goals across teams. So that's an important issue. But I would also want to go back to this observation I've made, which is often when a team is finding it quite difficult to look at individual perspectives and differences within the team, that's when you get labelling of teams out there. So everything is fine with our team, it's this other team that's the problem.
And I suppose I would kind of say, and the bit we're about to do might be, we might come back to this question if people are still interested, but I suppose the other thing I would say is if two teams are in conflict with each other, I would think about it a little bit like I might think about two people being in conflict with each other. And I suppose one of the things you're trying to do most of the time in that situation is help each person or each team start to understand the perspective of the other, not necessarily agree with, but find ways to move out of their position and become, if you like, curious and knowledgeable about the other position. And I think it's so common that the opportunities for that are rare. And I've got a colleague at the moment who's moved from managing an inpatient-based service to managing a community-based service. And he's starting to say in meetings, oh, well, a few months ago I would have said this, but now I'm managing this other bit. I can sort of see it from a different perspective now, and I never would have thought about it like this, and I can see what they were going on about. So in a very simple way, I think some of it is seeing what the opportunities are for unpacking some of that process. That doesn't mean that once you've seen it from the other perspective, the conflict will go away, but I would say that's often the sort of first step. So we can come back to that though, because some of this,
But-
what we're going to talk about now, might be relevant.
But Paul, what I would just say in response to that is that an observation I would make is that managers and leaders seem to have relatively little opportunities for peer support, sharing perspectives and gaining support from other people at the same level of the organisation as them. And I think this breeds into team conflict because you know much less about other people's services and perspectives.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to try and make sure we have at least 10 or 15 minutes for questions. So I'll try and contain this bit to sort of 10 or 15 minutes. So what makes a great team? There's lots and lots of different answers to this question and lots of different sort of research and kind of ideas. So what we've chosen to do, or what I've chosen to do, is just share one concept with you and see in a way if that's helpful, and at the end trying to think of it almost some sort of kind of practical things you could think about or try, so it isn't just a sort of set of concepts and you end up going, so what do I do with it? So the story I want to tell you is Google was asking this question, and they, I think back in about 2012, initiated really quite a massive project which they called Project Aristotle, and they called it that because apparently this philosopher was sort of famous for the quote of the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, or the perspective of that. And they were trying to understand what are the factors, and they looked at all kinds of factors. They looked at personality, they looked at performance of individuals, they looked at whether the teams were co-located, they looked at the workload size of the team, they looked at gender, they looked at all sort of whether they had shared interests, they looked at whether they had friendships outside of work, they looked at many different kinds of variables. They looked at the management style, they looked at the team structure, they looked at how long people had worked in the team, and so on and so on. So they looked at lots and lots of different kind of aspects of, in a way, what you might think would make a difference. And I think it's fair to say they were quite surprised by their own results. And I'm just going to share this sort of next slide, which kind of summarizes it. So in terms of order of importance, these were the top 5 factors that they found that made a difference to how teams performed and how people felt working in these teams. And I think somewhat to their surprise, the number 1 factor was this sort of idea of psychological safety. Now, this might be a kind of buzzword or a phrase you've heard before, it might not, and we're going to sort of take some time to talk about what that means. And then there were 4 other factors which we're not going to talk about as much today. Some of them we've sort of touched on, I think, already, but they were much less powerful in the actual kind of analysis. So basically, we're going to spend a bit of time talking a bit more about the psychological safety factor. So what does it mean? And the one simple definition is feeling and believing you won't be sort of punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And I think it's worth saying most of us don't get out of bed in the morning wanting to be punished or humiliated for saying or thinking or doing the wrong thing. So most people are naturally cautious about this. Most people are a bit worried about saying something silly or getting something wrong or being seen negatively. It's quite normal to feel like that. And so the teams that did well were the ones that made it safe to take these kinds of risks. So to ask what you might feel might be the silly question, to be able to raise what you know might be the unpopular idea, to in a way say you don't agree. And one quote I quite like that I've heard somebody use for this is, a psychologically safe team doesn't mean everybody always gets on and agrees and it's all kind of this sort of harmonious, we all see things the same way space. It's actually in some ways the opposite of that. It's a space that's safe for conflict, not safe from conflict. So it's a safe place to have disagreements, to share different ideas, to work through things from your different perspectives, not in a disrespectful way, but in an open and honest way, and to some extent feeling you don't have to constantly filter your opinion and your sort of views. And in the first Slido, some people were saying, I felt I had a voice. I felt I could contribute. And that's very much in the territory of psychological safety. So why does it matter if it's psychologically safe? So back to this VUCA idea. So no one person has the answer, remember? So everybody's contributions matter. We need everybody's contributions, and they won't give them if they don't feel it's safe to share honestly, to sort of engage in honest, sort of productive conflict, to say, no, I don't see it that way. I've got a different perspective. I'd come at that a bit differently. I've got another idea, but also to make and learn from mistakes. So to be able to say, I really thought I was doing the right thing there, but actually I need to be honest with everybody. I think that was an error. I think I want me and us to learn from that, or for the team as a whole to learn from mistakes. And it links to wellbeing and job satisfaction. We'll talk about that in a second. So why does it matter from a sort of science, sort of studying kind of position? And if people are interested in this, I'd recommend Amy Edmondson's book called The Fearless Organization, where she really quite systematically looks at this in lots of different organizations, lots of different examples. But there are lots and lots of studies showing it makes a difference for performance, for well-being and job satisfaction, and quite importantly in healthcare, for safety. And if you read the story of sort of safety in the airline and in healthcare situations, there is a quite striking journey, especially the airline industry has been on, around cabin environments where it felt safe to speak up and cabin environments where it felt unsafe to speak up. And some of those case studies, literally planes full of people died because people didn't feel it was safe to challenge the captain or one of the other senior crew members because of the culture of the cockpit. And that's what the airline industry has now worked very hard on. Psychological safety on its own doesn't guarantee all of these things. And Amy Edmondson talks about it as an enabling factor. So you might have a diverse team. You might be very proud you've made some effort to ensure your team is sufficiently diverse, both in terms of demographics and gender and ethnicity and race, but also in terms of professional expertise, all those things. If it's not safe, the diversity won't, in a way, come out. It won't be as helpful as it could be. And similarly for talent and expertise. And Google's study concluded it's this that makes the difference to the team's performance, rather than, so you could stuff a team full of really high performing people, but it won't be the best team compared to one that has a high degree of psychological safety. So this is a more important variable than a team full of really capable people. So how would you know? I mean, it looks to me from your kind of descriptions at the beginning, you sort of already know. But I'm going to offer you a few things to keep an eye out for. So a really simple one is when you have team meetings or team time, are they exciting? Do you find them engaging, or do you find them dull? Some people will say if you find them dull, and I don't mean dull in the sense of you'll feel scared and shut down, but dull just in the sense of bored. It can mean, or it's likely to mean, the things that are potentially more exciting because you don't agree and there's something to work out don't get airtime, or they don't come out because it doesn't feel psychologically safe to talk about them.
Paul, I wonder if putting in something there about does team time make you feel anxious or even afraid is important. Yes. Because where there's a real problem with safety, people get very anxious before coming together as a team.
We're going to come on to that.
Oh, yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Well, it's exactly what Arabella just said. How does it feel to you when you are thinking about saying something? So in this world of Teams meetings, I've heard people talk to this as the unmute moment. So people, you know, somebody might say, what do people think? And you think, well, I've got an idea or I've got a perspective, but I don't know if it's going to go down very well. And so how does it feel? Do you feel anxious? Do you feel okay? Do you feel quite safe? It's fine, you know, this group is fine to say what you think. How does that feel? The other thing to notice is turn taking and airtime. One of the things they found in the Google study is psychologically safe teams, roughly, people had reasonably similar amounts of airtime. So most members of the team contributed a similar amount? Is this a space where one or two people do a lot of or all the talking and other people don't do much? Do some people never say anything? So that's a bit of a mark, can be a bit of a marker. Or come back to elephant keeping, because that's covered in a different space. And then kind of questions about, is it okay to, for example, share bad news, as in something's gone wrong, to talk about mistakes, to offer a different point of view. And then in a more kind of formal way, this is a sort of 5-minute psychological safety quiz or audit. And you'll see these are sort of similar questions. I won't read them all out, but how does it feel if you make a mistake in the team? Are people able to bring up problems and tough issues? Is it difficult to ask other people in the team for help? Is it safe to take a risk, and so on and so on? So, how to build psychological safety? And I think it's worth acknowledging there is a crucial role here for people in leadership positions. But I think it's also worth saying, and I suppose this goes back to Arabella's point about teams where everything is in a way put on the leader as it's up to the leader. It is also a shared responsibility, and in a way leadership from the whole team can make a difference to this. And even a leader that's very determined to create psychological safety might struggle with a team that's previously been very unsafe, for example. So I'm just checking time. I've got, I think, 2 more slides. So one is about shared beliefs and values. So I think it can be helpful to be quite explicit, to say no one's got all the answers. There's some research that leaders who are prepared to say, I don't know the answer to this, function better than leaders that try to show or pretend or convince people they always do have the answer. Everyone's voice matters. So explicitly saying we want to hear from people. And that to some extent, and this can be difficult, especially if you feel strongly about something, that different opinions and beliefs are sort of welcomed in, that you are between you trying to create a sense that we want to hear even different points of view when we're sort of doing the work that we're doing. So behaviorally, what does that look like? So sometimes it can be really helpful to ask questions rather than make statements. And sometimes when conflict gets going, and I really noticed this in myself, you start trying to convince people of your position rather than ask them about theirs. And that sometimes also goes with, if you're finding a particular person frustrating, can you get to know them a bit better? Back to this sort of inter-team idea, I suppose. Encouraging dissent and different viewpoints. So people that in the team, and it doesn't always have to be the leader, who might ask things like, does anyone have a different opinion? I've been to quite a lot of meetings where a few people will make a suggestion. Somebody chairing the meeting will say something like, so are we all agreed that's what we're doing then? It's not particularly easy at that point to say, no, actually, I don't agree. If somebody at that point says, does anybody have a different opinion? It might be a bit more facilitating to say, actually, I might do. Encouraging equal contributions, noticing airtime. Does somebody or some people talk a lot and some people not talk much? Again, inviting people in or saying things like, I wonder if somebody, the people that haven't said much want to comment on any of this. There's a few people who've done a lot of the talking. What about everyone else, kind of thing? The other way of doing it is actually having structures or activities that increase contributions from the whole team. And a presentation I went to earlier, a few days ago, somebody gave an example of somebody who gave a talk and then said, right, feedback, give it to me. And then somebody else that said, right, we want you to get into small groups. And this group we want, like, say, if it was a healthcare setting, you might think, right, this group we want you to think about our most complex patients. This group we want you to think about the trust management's perspective. This group we want you to think about staff, the team's perspective. And this group we want you to think about CQC. And we want you to give us feedback from all those perspectives. So that's a structured way of encouraging people to contribute that might give you a different response. And then a few more sort of practical ideas, I guess. The elephant keeper, challenger, devil's advocate. So somebody, and you can move the role around, it's their job to put in some challenge, to name the things that aren't being talked about that might be difficult, to deliberately take a different point of view. So it's then not you having to stick your neck out, if you like. It's part of the role you've been assigned. We've talked a bit about using structure and different channels. So this was sort of pre-digital, but we once did it where we had a post box and people could write comments and feedback on cards or post-it notes and post it anonymously in the post box. Slido is a good example of an anonymous digital feedback system, and also giving people the chance to contribute in a group setting and sort of individually. Now, some of these you might say, well, that means it's not very psychologically safe, doesn't it? But, you know, if it was really safe, people would just say, and I agree with that, but some of these things can be sort of stepping stones on the way. So I think psychological safety is a sort of, for most teams, a work in progress. Some things will always be more difficult to talk about than others. And so some of these mechanisms are just different ways of facilitating people's voices coming out. So I'm going to leave you with three, what Megan Ritz describes as 3 listen up traps. And although she doesn't explicitly talk about psychological safety, when I listened to her talk, I thought these are absolutely brilliantly in the space of this. This was aimed more at leaders, but I think actually most of these apply to everybody. So one is we can forget how scary we are. So that might be because of your position or title, but it might be because you're the one that's worked in the team a long time. It might be because of your age or your gender or your race. It might be because, you know, if you're in a bit of a bad mood, people find you hard to approach. So there's something about seeing ourselves as others do, and realizing are the ways in which we might be difficult or off-putting to either approach or give feedback to. Her second thing was question the list, and the list is, who are the people you always go to? Who are the people you will ask, you will sort of phone after a meeting and say, what did you think of that? Or who are the people you will tend to ask for advice or for feedback? And lists like this, most of us, or probably all of us, have them. They can be really useful, but there's something about being able to, I suppose, in a way, reflect on it. So who's on the list? Do they look or think a bit like you? And who's not on the list? Why aren't they on the list? And are there opportunities? Are you missing anything? And might there be opportunities to connect with people who perhaps are a bit different or might just hold different perspectives to you? So you're not always in a kind of echo chamber of people who will agree with you in a way. And then the final one is what she called shut up signals rather than listen up signals. And a simple one, and Teams has been quite helpful for this, is know your face. And I think there's 2 things to that. One is sometimes you might realize you're actually really listening, and you really want to know, but you might make a face which is sort of like this. And so in your mind, you're intensely interested, but they're thinking, wow, I don't know if I should carry on talking. The other one is actually you're just giving yourself away, and you're looking bored, you're rolling your eyes. I think Megan also talked about, and you know, on the call right now, how many people are doing their emails or multitasking in some way. People always think they can get away with it, and usually most people can tell if you're doing that. So what are the things you're doing non-verbally that might give people a message actually you don't want to hear them? So those are just some sort of practical things to leave you with. So I've not done very well in terms of the time, but we have got 5 minutes, so I will stop there, and we'll sort of have a little bit of space for questions.
Thank you. Fantastic session, and as you will shortly see from the chat box, I think people absolutely agree with me. Now, there's lots of comments. If anyone does have any questions, please feel free to raise your hands and come and talk to Paul and Arabella. I'll start reading some of the comments. Things like peer support is essential, and sometimes comes back to Dave's point that senior leaders are afraid to share how they're feeling in case it's assumed they are failing.
Yeah, we got to get away from this idea that showing any vulnerability or need for others or having a problem is something that leaders shouldn't experience. It's a very unhelpful idea, I think.
Absolutely. And kind of going on from that point, Jane talked about when as a manager you don't feel you get support from your line manager, it's difficult to know where to go next. So that's something also to consider. A great comment from Sharon: I manage my team as how I like to be managed. My manager really supports me, so I hope my teams feel the same, which is brilliant. And we do have a raised hand. So Dave, would you like to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks. I'm really great. I'm really enjoying this, by the way, and I could let it go on for longer and longer and longer. But how would we encourage people, Arabella and Paul, who are really, and I don't mean frightened, scared, I just mean they are so concerned that they will be flagged up as they're not doing a good job. And it doesn't matter whether we go, you've got freedom to speak up, we've got psychological support, we've got well-being. How could we, because often people come to us as L&D and OD and go, how do I support my team better? And the first thing we say is, what support do you get? And they go, well, I don't think I do. How do we get over that first step? I mean, this stuff is all great, spot on, but how do we, what language, what should we be saying to someone to take the first step?
In a leadership role, Dave, or in a
Yes, yeah, in a leadership role.
Do you want to answer? I've got some.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's no quick answer to that, but I think you've got to sort of think about that. The first thing is being able to talk about it, being able to communicate about it. And we at Stronger Together have worked with quite a lot of leaders trying to think about the interaction, talk truth to power, raise an issue. Often I think seeing the issue, raising the issue can take it away from the personal. So I think a lot of this emphasis on the importance of psychological safety, we can really use it in our interactions by talking in a team and saying, I think maybe as a team, we need to think about psychological safety. There's a problem here in this team about being able to communicate about the things we need to communicate about. And that's a much easier way of approaching the problem than saying to an individual, I find you intimidating, or you always seem to be in a bad mood. You're sort of raising it as an issue that's really to do with team health. So I think that's a way of doing it.
No, that's excellent. Thanks. We've had like I said, over the last few months, we've had a few people come in and ask us about this, but if we could steal your slides, that would help us in a good way. But thank you.
And Dave, I think there's two bits in your question. One is somebody saying they don't feel very managerially supported. And I think the key thing then is to help them think about what are the range of options to feel better supported, and in a way with what. So is it that they can see that perhaps the team doesn't feel safe and they want support about how to make it feel safer, or is it more broadly they don't feel supported? So that, because there is lots of evidence the way we treat people has a big influence on the way they treat others. So if they don't feel, that it's kind of like a cascade. The other bit, actually, are they saying, how do I have this conversation with my team? Then I think you're more in the territory of thinking about how you might design some sort of space or a way space for that. Stephen Pope, who's just put in the chat that he'd done a 360 feedback from his team, which was very nerve-wracking but useful and pinpointed areas for me as a manager and leader to look at. So things like that, if you're willing to engage in that sort of process or feel in the right place to do that, I also think that's very powerful. And if you're willing to do that as a leader, and then ideally, I think sort of have some of that conversation with your team, so you're looking at yourself and how you're experienced. I think that's great role modeling for starting off that process, if you see what I mean. And some of it, I think, is about people starting to and feeling supported to take steps along the road of showing and sharing vulnerability, which is what a lot of this really is kind of talking to, if that makes sense.
No, that's spot on. Thanks very much, and we can feed that back to some people we've had conversations with. Appreciate it.
Sure.
There's lots more comments, and I'm loving Arabella's rock music.
I know. I think I've got to tell my team. Paul, this is David was saying that the word team connotes competition.
Right.
Comes from sport and competition. And I just shared that, because if you think about, you can think about a team as being like a rock band. It's with the coming together of a band and the creativity of the work you do together, the different instruments people play. I think playing with language in this way, Dave, really opens things up.
It does give it a different perspective.
Yeah, it's interesting. Sorry, no, go on, Dawn.
No, go on, Paul.
No, I was just going. It's just it's just interesting what teams connotes for people, isn't it? I suppose competition definitely comes out of a sports teams type thing, doesn't it? But yeah. So, but yeah, I think having different ways to play with what it means to you is really useful.
Absolutely. And our very own Anne talks about having the team environment to take risks and therefore make mistakes is so important as long as we learn from them. If you have a team when you can't get it wrong, it stifles creativity, trust, honesty, and innovation. Stephen talks about there's a very similar approach in surgery departments and theatres. Arabella's just sort of mentioned Dave's team kind of connotation. I think we're now going to be called the Magpies, Harrison Magpies. We need to consider team cultures and attitudes that's coming out. Beth is talking about that 5-minute psychological safety audit that you showed us. Would be great to ask all teams to consider going forward. Got a great quote from Dave in the chat that talks about bad attitude is like a flat tire. You can't go anywhere until you change it. And kind of Stephen talks about, I think sometimes we can't change people, just our approach to them. I absolutely agree with that. Always good to give people time to speak up outside of the team meeting and having a team suggestion or innovation box in the office. This could be virtual, as I think, Paul, you mentioned using Microsoft Forms. Some people just aren't comfortable for many reasons to speak in a big group. Oliver, has read a book called Zach, The Lightning of Empowerment. He read it years ago and it was a major influence for him because its focus is on empowering the team. And a lot of what's been highlighted today has been touched on in the book as well.
Yeah.
Sharon manages 2 teams that are very small. And one of her approaches is that they go to the office 1 day a week to come together. And she also arranges regular lunchtime catch-ups to come together away from work. Lots more in the chat. So Beth is as the guardian and having people speak up to me. Some really would not approach a senior manager because they're assumed to be too busy. An open door situation is not enough to encourage staff to speak up. And Stephen again talks about being aware of your presence. So if a senior leader comes into the room, it changes the dynamic of that workspace. And it's important for managers to approach team members to ask for their feedback on any parts of their daily working lives, which then is where Stephen talked about very bravely doing that 360 feedback.
And I think that comment about your presence, the other thing that I remember Megan said is people in positions or leadership positions often don't, ironically, necessarily feel that sort of powerful or scary. So I do think something you can miss. Like some years ago, somebody came and spoke to me about something in the area I lead. And he said, "Oh, I would have come to see you sooner, but you're the head of psychology. You're quite scary." And I remember thinking, "Am I? Gosh, I don't think of myself as particularly scary." But obviously, I was from his point of view, which when you think about it, kind of makes sense. So it's something I think to continually kind of be aware of, and I think people often don't, in the busyness of it all, don't have time to do that almost, or don't think to do that.
And what I'll do is I will let you guys have a look at the rest of the thank yous on the chat box, and I'll hand back to Dave.
No, Dawn, thank you very much. Paul, Arabella, absolutely. Like I said, I reckon we could pull easily another hour out of this or more. I think it's a great topic. We can tell by the numbers that it's been, people are here for a reason. And also I can see in the chat box, someone has just put, everyone across the system should get this. I think it's a great place to start. And what's interesting, the team's chat box now has actually become a resource. It's become a resource full of information. But thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen now to bring this to sort of close, but just to cover some slides before we finish. But let's remember what we've just talked about here, what we just shared, that it is okay not to be okay, but the importance of reaching out. Now, who that is and where it is, it doesn't matter, but there will always be someone across the system, across the network, to put their hand out and reach out and give you that support. And I think there is something about, taking that first step, whatever that looks like. And that can be the most courageous thing that you actually do in your whole career, that when things feel like it's coming in on you, is to put that hand out and ask for help. So please, if you've got a smartphone, you can see all the details are there, and there will be some stuff being added into the chat box in a moment as well. Feedback's a gift. There's no such thing as failure, only feedback, and we should embrace feedback of all, positive, negative. I don't like the word negative. Opportunity for development, how about that? But if you've got one of those funky phones that you've got the QR code scanner, please go on, give us feedback, and you'll be into this competition. So a free subscription to the Happy News. You can see the little emoji waving along there, which kind of makes me smile because it's at my level of entertainment. Every day I believe in having fun. Also, lots more resources, lots more information about the festival. So please get your phones and QR code that as well, and you will see there's lots more for you to attend. Snapshot now if you want. There's a picture of the calendar. So please, we're only on day 3, and I can't believe the wealth of information that we've had. And it's now, like I said, it has now become a resource, and resources are only good if you know where to find them. So please share, be nosy, get your colleagues, pass it on to your friends, family, whatever, have a look, and the QR code is next to that as well. If you're down with the kids and you're into the socials, so any of those kind of Twitters and Instagram stuff, then the hashtag VWBF22, please use that and say something nice, say something opportunist, say something that is going to create your colleagues, your friends to be nosy and go, what are they doing over there that we're not doing? And then they can go watch all this stuff on Spotlight, etc. But thank you very much to Paul and Arabella for a fantastic session. Thanks to all those who've come in and helped and supported and interacted in the chat box, and Dawn and everyone, Louise behind the counter, behind the screen, doing the stuff there as well. But have a great afternoon, and please join on the keynote one in about an hour's time. But thank you very much, ladies and gents. Enjoy your morning and then your afternoon. It's been an absolute pleasure.